My name is Rich Schmidt. We're here with Felicity Carter. It's March 6, 2025. We're in the Nicholson Library at Linfield University in McMinnville. Felicity, thank you so much for joining us today.
It is such a pleasure to be here.
First question is, why wine?
Well, it was actually, for me, it was journalism. I got really interested in journalism after September 11, and so I went back to university and trained as a postgraduate, and I had the idea that I was going to be an international correspondent, hopefully a war correspondent, because I'd been very inspired by the sort of television I'd seen. And it turned out that if you're a mature age student and you graduate and you can't speak Arabic, Russian or Chinese, your chances of being given a role as a foreign correspondent are approximately zero. So I started freelancing. I started pitching to newspapers, and I had worked in Sydney for a very famous direct marketing company writing brochures about wine, and they'd done some in-house training. And so I pitched a story about wine to a major metropolitan newspaper, The Age, and it must have been a slow news day that day because they actually took it. And the thing is that as soon as you get, in those days, this is 2003, in those days, if you got into a major metropolitan paper, all hell broke loose because all the publicists would say, who is she, and whatever. And people started inviting me to things, but I had no idea of how competitive and brutal wine writing was in Australia. And so it was very male dominated in those days, and it was very locked up from people who'd grown up in Adelaide. And they saw me as this interloper who knew nothing about wine, both of which were true. But it was quite a brutal experience. Like, people were really horrible. So I was like, damn you. So I used to go home at night and I used to look at, I think the database was either Factiva or Nexus, where you look at the newspapers, what's been published. So every night I would look at what was being published around the world on wine to see if I could find something to pitch to the Australian newspaper, and I did. And so I got more and more stuff in the newspaper, and then I realised I was a wine writer.
That's amazing.
Well, actually, I did a lot of other things. I did a lot of science reporting. I did some reporting on oil and gas. I wrote a massive, well-read article about innovation in the funeral industry. So for a while, I used to freelance for a magazine about dogs. So I didn't just. And then what happened was I always wanted to work overseas. That was my primary goal. But I didn't have any visas. I had an Australian passport and no right to work anywhere else. And then I saw a job ad for a German publishing house. So about 16, 17 years ago, a lot of European companies wanted to move into the English-speaking world. And so you got hilarious movies where the actors clearly didn't understand the script they were reciting. You got terrible French publications, half written in French and badly translated into English. But this German publishing house, Meininger Verlag, recognised that they needed somebody who was a native speaker who understood about wine. So they were offering a 1-year contract, and I was like, great, it comes with a work visa. So I went there and I did it. I slept on the floor for 3 months. It was wild. And it was a very different working environment. And one thing led to another, and I ended up being editor-in-chief of that journal for 12 years. So I stayed in Europe. And every single person who knows I'm in Germany, which is where I live, go, so did you marry a German? And I always go, you sexist pig. It was a job.
We'll come back to that in a minute. Let's back up and talk about kind of life before that. Tell us about where you were born and raised and sort of your early education and career.
Well, this is going to surprise you. It surprised the Germans. I was born in Germany. My parents were military. My father was in the army. And so I was born in Iserlohn, North Rhine-Westphalia on a British army base. So I've got a British birth certificate, which is ironic because everyone thinks I'm British, and I'm not. And so I spent my life as a kid moving around the world. I mean, I went to high school in Virginia for a while. I went to 9 different schools in a number of different countries. And then I landed up in Sydney in my adult life. So that's where I spent my adult life before I went to Europe.
Coming out of school, was journalism the plan?
It was not, no. I wanted to be on stage. But if you're a middle-class Australian and your parents are professionals, they do not go, yes, go to drama school. They go, like hell. And so they said, go to university and get something to fall back on. So I went to university to study science. I majored in genetics. And then after second year, I dropped out and I went and studied music. So that's what I did.
So at what point did writing become something you were interested in?
Well, I always was, even as a kid. So when I was in America, my mum used to subscribe to Writer's Digest magazine for me, which was great. So by the time I was by the time we left America, I had this huge pile of them in my bedroom. It was the saddest thing about leaving America was having to leave all my pile of Writer's Digest. And then many years later, you could get it in Australia, so I subscribed to it there as well. So I was always writing, even as a kid. I think my mother could see where my life was going more clearly than I could.
What was your first introduction to wine?
Well, it was actually when I got a job at Cellar Master. So there's a company in Sydney which was very friendly in those days, was very friendly to performers. So the guy who founded it believed that they sold everything by telephone and by brochures, and he believed that actors would be really good at speaking on phones, that they could improvise. And so as a result, he built this company that was completely based on the performing arts. So it was this sort of hotbed of people who were opera singers and television stars and theatre performers. And the idea was you go and work there, and if you got a gig, they would give you the time off for the tour or whatever. You can always just get your job back, and they'd give $1,000 worth of sparkling for opening night, and they'd buy up $1,000 worth of tickets. So every single person involved in the arts in Sydney beat a path towards Cellar Masters, and that's how I ended up there. So writing their brochures, but they gave you wine training. And so that's how I learned about wine. But before then, I barely drank alcohol, and I certainly didn't drink wine. I didn't understand anything about it. So, but of course, having that tiny little bit of training made me a complete expert, and I think I was insufferable for a really long time.
So tell me about your process of learning about wine, of educating yourself. Once you started down that path, how did you go about learning it, and what sort of kept you wanting to learn more?
Well, so I've always taken the point of view that I work in media, that I don't work in wine. And so my goal is to know enough that I can ask intelligent questions and I can spot bullshit if somebody spins it, but it's not my job to be the expert. It's my job to know how to interview the experts. So obviously, in my role with mining I ended up reporting from 22 countries, and if you spend that much time talking to people, you learn things. I also went and did WSET up to level 3, which was a trauma because I did a week of it in a wine company actually said, we're running a course in Warsaw, why don't you come along and do the 1 week, the intensive? And I was like, great. So I hired a Airbnb and they said, here's the book, make sure you read the book before you come. And I was like, no, I've been editor of a wine journal. I don't need to read the book. And I got there and I was like, oh, I should have read the book. And it was the most difficult week of my life. I was walking around Warsaw late at night talking to myself, waving my arms around.
From the perspective of editor-in-chief editing this journal, tell me about what was intriguing to you about wine as you learned about it.
Well, I'm not trying to duck the question, but it was never wine. It was always the people. I really love the people. And I came to have a view of wine, which is that it's the whole culture of wine is kind of a riposte to the world that we live in, especially as things get more technological and also as people get more exploitative, as things get more corporate and, the demands that you spend more of your life at work. And I think when you're drinking wine, wine demands that you sit down and have lunch with people and that you sit and talk to people. And so I came to see that was a really, really valuable thing. But what interested me was I was editor of a business journal. We were like the Economist of wine. And I was intensely interested in how wine functioned as a business and as an industry. So I think there's two types of wine knowledge, really. There's people who understand every crew in Beaujolais, and they can tell you every producer, and they can tell you who uses amphora and who doesn't, and I have none of that knowledge. What I can do is I can tell you how the region functions and how it functions within France and within the international wine trade.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So tell me about getting to learn that and starting to understand how wine functions. You mentioned obviously that it sort of demands of you, it demands your time and attention. How do you find that it fits in the world?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I think it's a lot more important than people think it is. You talk to people and wine is we talk a lot about how it's a historic product and it's blah, 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 blah. And actually it is. It's a really significant product. Let me give you an example. So in Australia, if you grow up in Australia, which I didn't, as we've established, but if you were to go to primary school in Australia, they would teach you a lot about a guy called MacArthur who introduced the merino sheep. And this is a really important moment in Australian history. And I've come to see that actually they should be teaching James Busby, who introduced the vine into Australia, because the vine has had an enormous impact both culturally and economically. And we're sort of blind to it. And one of the things I learned in travelling the world, particularly in travelling in ex-Soviet countries, is how much the vineyard has been used as a tool of politics. So if countries like Georgia or Moldova want to break away from Russia, the first thing the Russians do is they ban imports of those wines. It's actually a very, very significant thing that we don't give it the full weight of how significant it is.
Tell me about a story you worked on, or a person you met, or an adventure you had kind of early on that was meaningful to you. As you look back, what were some of the kind of the moments for you that kind of made you want to learn more, made you want to dig in, made you want to be part of that?
In wine, you're talking about. I think the one that really changed me, actually, was in 2005. I was travelling around Australia and I was doing some work for a sort of small magazine. And I went to a place in Western Australia, which was a new region. And I met somebody there who had started a winery. He'd worked in the mining industry in Western Australia, which is a very, very lucrative industry. But he'd done his back in, and so he'd had workers' compensation, and he'd started a winery with it. And I went to the winery and tried the wines, and it was very evident he didn't know anything about wine. The wines were all oxidised, and it was very clear that they were going broke. And so I was like, oh, this is really interesting. And so that was the thing that interested me in the economics of it. So I went back to Sydney and I pitched a story to the Melbourne Age where I said, I think the Australian wine industry is in trouble. And I wrote a really big, much remarked on story, which at the time the Australian wine industry was at its height, particularly in the United States. And so I said, so I started ringing people in the United States and they started telling me about Australian wine being piled up in warehouses and not selling or having to be discounted. And I think it's not going to posh wineries that was the most interesting thing. It was going to that winery and seeing this guy's wife begging me to write nice things about their wine because they were in trouble. That turned into a very, very big story that actually in some ways was really the start of my career because so many people took notice of that story.
So as you kind of dove into the business side of wine, what did you find, what surprised you about how wine functions as a business?
How badly it operates, how catastrophically terrible it operates as a business. I think what interested me was how almost mystical it is. And I mean, there's good reasons for that. The vine has very deep roots inside Greco-Roman culture, the culture that we have inherited. But people are very romantic about wine, which I think is the good side of wine, but the bad side of wine is how romantic people are. And over the years, especially as I was a business editor, so many people, you'd ask them questions about their distribution or about whatever, and they couldn't answer it. And it became obvious that this is an industry which is distorted by how many people either have too much money, so they've gone into it, or are doing it as a hobby, or are doing it because they're parents did it or whatever. And so I think what we're seeing now is a kind of car crash effect of many, many years of people, funnily enough, taking the product very seriously but not taking the business of wine very seriously. And that actually became an extreme frustration. Because on the other hand, you had these big companies, these corporate companies, that took the business side very seriously but didn't take the wine very seriously. And they did tremendous damage to the wine industry by beginning to treat it as just another branded commodity. And so these two forces, I think, between them have done the wine trade a lot of disservice.
That's such an interesting perspective. I like that. Give me an example. You mentioned obviously Australia and you kind of uncovering struggles there. Other places you've seen that, or other, I guess other things you've dug into where you've seen you've been able to see something bad coming down the line. Have you gotten to the point where you can kind of see it coming now?
Yes, but then we're at the point where everybody can see it coming. So my Cassandra mantle is now in retirement because other people are doing that as well. Yes, I mean, I think the most startling one I've ever seen, the one that moved me the most, was I went to Moldova in 2014, and wine is incredibly important to Moldova. It's actually linked with their history, and it's linked with their own mythology about themselves. And it's linked to, there's some story about how they kept the Ottoman Turks out of Europe because they were able to, the soldiers were able to survive on grapes. So it's this profound and meaningful product to them. But what had happened was they'd been selling all their wine to the Russian market. And that is a disaster because it meant they were never asked to improve the quality of their wine. They were making wine that was very poor quality. And they tried to get closer to EU, and the Russians did what they always do, which is they decided, they made a declaration that the wine was bad and they weren't going to buy anymore. And this whole country was almost paralysed in the face of it. And so I walked, they have these amazing underground cellars, which were originally limestone quarries that are now these underground streets. And I went to one winery, and there was this woman, and her whole life had been this winery. She was 62 in a country where that's pretty much the lifespan. And she was doing the spiel that she'd obviously done for years and years and years. And she was taking us through this thing and showing us the sparkling wine. And here's the sparkling wine rack where we riddle every day. And that rack hadn't been riddled. There were so many cobwebs on it that nobody had touched that for 8 years at least. In fact, the Romanians actually made a Dracula movie in those cellars. There were so many cobwebs. And I'm not laughing because it was the most awful thing I think I've ever seen, was just the destruction of that. And this woman, continuing to play the role of, whatever, when it was obviously, a terrible thing to have happened.
So at that point in your career, tell me how you were traveling, where you traveled. How were you seeking out stories, or how were you finding stories at that point?
Well, it's very simple. Somebody would offer me an invitation to somewhere interesting, and I'd say, yes, why yes, I would love to come and see that thing. Sign me up. There was not a lot of planning involved. Because when you're an editor of a magazine, everybody wants your attention, and everybody wants you to come and visit them and whatever. And I learned very early on not to take press trips to regions. I had no interest in being schlepped around a region on a bus with 10 other people, and the region dictating what you were going to see and whatever. But what I did get very interested in was seeing off the beaten places. So I was very happy. I got invited a couple of times to go to rural Russia to see their emerging sort of wine industry there. That was very interesting. The Dutch government invited me to go and see Bolivia, where they were trying to. So the Spanish colonised Bolivia in the 16th century. And they grew vines there to supply the silver mines. And they grew them in a way that is not done anymore, which is the vine was trained over trees. And there's a sort of valley there where there was an interest in trying to get UNESCO to preserve this valley because these grapes weren't economic anymore. So I went and did things like that, and I found things like that extremely interesting. So it wasn't about whether the wine is high quality or not. It's like, is there a really interesting thing going on here? And yeah, there's some really interesting things.
As you were deciding whether to go to these places or hearing about them, were there common factors for you? Were there things you were looking for in a story? Obviously, you mentioned the wine quality wasn't something you were so curious about. Was it purely just a story that hadn't been told?
Yeah, I mean, look, if you go to Tuscany, everybody goes to Tuscany. You're not going to find a story in Tuscany. You're really not. Everybody goes everywhere, but who goes to Bolivia? That's pretty interesting. So, So I liked that kind of thing, where I could go somewhere and see something that was genuinely novel and interesting, and said something about the way the world was changing.
I don't think many people have probably traveled as many places as you to write about wine. So I'm curious about commonalities. What are wine's commonalities in the world?
People are nuts everywhere in the world, and they're nuts in exactly the same way. They're all crazy, and they're all romantic, and they're all quasi-mystical about the wine. and that's it. I mean, I've got a friend of mine who travels the world by opera sofas. He's a principal with Opera Australia, and he was telling me that he can go anywhere where there's an opera house and someone will put him up for the night. And I was going, well, I can do that with wine, and the accommodation's better because most places have got guest houses and there's more wine places in the world. But it's true, it's the most incredibly hospitable industry. It's the best of humans, basically. Even when you're in a place where, especially if you go somewhere like Russia, where geopolitically it's a bit they're a bit dubious about you, they still offer you a great breakfast and a great place to stay, and they're still extremely proud of what they do. And it's about being sort of human in that context. And unless you drink too much and then you get into a raging fight after dinner. Best not to do that in some places.
I guess the next question to that to me is commonality of story. Are there stories you see everywhere?
Yes, and much too much so. So unfortunately, a lot of people would say to me, how do we get in the media and whatever, but they'd tell you this. I mean, I've actually done workshops on storytelling, and I've gone and done it in Italy, I've done it in Australia, and it's always the same story that people tell. They'll tell you that they got passionate about wine, and they're very passionate, and the wine is made in the vineyard, and you just want to go, go to sleep. Unfortunately, wine people have a very limited sort of vocabulary about the way they talk about their own lives, and to their detriment, actually.
So, in your workshop, what did you encourage?
Telling the truth. And this is actually a really big problem. So in the New World, so-called New World, people will tell you the truth. And I think that's the great strength of countries like America and of Australia and New Zealand. So I was in Australia doing this storytelling workshop, and somebody said to me, and then, World War II happened and stuff. And I went, wait a second, what do you mean, and stuff? And she said the guy that owned the winery came back with amputated limbs because of the Second World War, and because of this they lost the winery. And then later on the family, clawed and worked and they bought it back. And I was like, well, that's an amazing story. That is a really great story. I mean, not about being severely injured, to be clear. What I hadn't realised is I used to talk about this a lot in Europe. So I'd go and give these workshops where, first of all, I'd do a sort of, here's the theory of how you tell stories. And, there's a lot of research around how you hook people's attention and stuff. And then we do a workshop and everyone will tell their stories. It doesn't work in Europe, and I've come to understand why, which is that some of the history is just too close to the bone and nobody wants to talk about, and you, especially in places like Spain or Portugal, which weren't that long ago were under dictators, people just don't. So if you go and talk to somebody in Spain, they're not going to tell you what happened in the First World War or during those periods. It's just there's no discussion about it at all. And so I came to understand that the way people talk about what they do is culturally very different and can be very constrained.
From a consumer's perspective, what sells wine? Why do people buy the wine they buy?
Well, it depends on which segment of the market you're talking about. So many people drink wine because they were introduced to it. So if you look at fine wine, for example, it's always been a classic case of, my dad had a cellar, and it was always my dad, right? And my granddad probably had a cellar, and so we grew up. The number of stories I've read about, I had this bottle of Chateau Lafite 1957, and that's when I completely fell in love, And people say to me, what's your wine origin story? When did you know you liked wine? And I'll tell you the story. So I was working at Cellar Masters, and I'll get back to your question in a second, but this is how I got into wine, right? So I was at Cellar Masters, and they was giving us these training, and they kept telling us about all of these characteristics in wine, and I didn't get any of them. To me, it just smelled like wine, right? And they used to send us a case of wine every month, which I used to give away to my friends, but one night I was injured. I'd burned my arm really badly, and I'd just come back from hospital and stuff, and so I was like, I'm going to have a glass of wine, I'm going to try this. And I got this bottle, and it was Cranswick Estate Cabernet Sauvignon. Now, Cranswick Estate was in the Riverland area, which is the bulk wine area. And so I poured some, and I went, hang on, there's a character in there I can get, hang on. And there's a drink in Australia, it's called Ribena. It's for kids. It's this sickly sweet blackcurrant syrup that your mum gives you, right? It's got this powerful thing. And I was like, oh my God, this has got Ribena. And then I was like, oh, I got one. It's got a black currant. And then I was like, okay, what comes next? And I was like, okay, it's kind of smooth and round, and it's got no structure. And then I was like, I can do this. And that's my wine origin story. So who drinks wine? You have to be introduced to it in some way. It's too much for most people to go and buy a bottle off the shelf. Many people get introduced to it through work. The number of women, for example, now who are whose work demands that they go and take out clients, and they're supposed to know how to navigate the wine list. And a lot of those women go and end up doing WSET. So if your family does it, if your culture does it, if somebody around you does it, it's really through family and friends.
What about sort of specific bottles or brands? Why are some of them popular? Why do people buy when they're in a grocery store? Why do they pick out certain wines?
Oh, well, there's two answers to that. One is if you have the first mover advantage, you'll always do really well. So if you're a fine wine and you were created back in, 1725 and you've managed to survive that long, people know who you are. You've developed a reputation that keeps people coming back. Unfortunately, the answer, and I know people like hearing this, is familiarity. So the more somebody has heard of something, the more likely they are to buy it. I'll tell you where things changed is actually with rosé. So rosé came along about 10 years ago. I mean, rosé's been around for a really, really long time, but rosé sort of exploded in the last 15 years or so. And for the first time, you didn't have to know anything about wine. You could just drink it. And it didn't matter what you drank, it was fine. And the rosé producers came out with all these amazing bottles that were really interesting. And so people began to buy, did it look really good? They liked the colour. So millennial pink had taken off on Instagram. So there was a lot of, the fact that there was nothing to know about rosé other than I can buy a bottle actually brought a lot of people into the category.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So tell us about Drinks Insider.
Oh, okay. So I'm glad you asked. It's my new media venture. It's a podcast where I interview people who are entrepreneurs in drinks. It's not just about wine. I interview a lot of people in the non-alcoholic space and in the spirits space. Basically, what everybody wants to know is they want to know, how do I make money in this business? So I go and try and find people who know how to make money in the business. And especially, most of my audience are wine people, I know that. And they're all really keen. And now people send me questions. I go, can you find out about this? Or can you find out about this? Which I try and do my best. I have a newsletter which is very heavily subscribed, but unfortunately, I haven't been very good about, I sort of lurch from, I'm not very organised, I lurch from like suddenly contributing a lot to suddenly I'm travelling and I contribute nothing. So it's actually become a source of guilt and shame that I need to write a lot more for my newsletter. And I also write research reports. So people ask me about export markets and I go and find out about it, or I'm writing a white paper at the moment on the politics of alcohol and health.
Well, that's actually excellent because we're talking about that in a second. But before we do, tell me about the genesis of the idea for Drinks Insider and about, I guess, how it's gone so far.
Well, as I said, I consider myself first and foremost a media person, not a wine person. And I know wine people think that they're in a bad market at the moment, but you should try and be a media person in the market. Like it is a bloodbath out there. And I'm really lucky. I have some retainer clients, but I'm really well aware that people who, you really have to be doing your own thing. And so I thought, what do I know about? What do I know about? And I remain a wine business reporter. I don't think the world needs my opinion on wine. It really doesn't. As much as I would like to offer my opinion on wine, and I think people should listen, they never do. I think me going and finding out things like how can you make money is a more useful thing to do. And I've been surprised at how quickly it's taken off, like really. And I've discovered I love podcasting. I just absolutely love it. So I have this guy in South Africa who's he's an audio engineer and he does a lot of work for film and television and he does brilliant production. So he's worked out what equipment I need in my little office and stuff like that, and I love it. I did some radio when I was at university, and I forgot how much I love just sitting interviewing people.
Tell me about it. Okay, then. So before we move on to sort of the current state of wine, I'm curious about if you're talking to people now in this day and age of how to be successful in alcohol or wine specifically. What are the keys right now? Number one is learn to use a spreadsheet.
No, seriously. I wrote this on LinkedIn once and everyone abused me. They said, do you mean make wine by recipe? I was like, no, understand financials. That's the absolute key. That's what you need to do. You need to understand financials. And if you can understand financials, you are now graduated from the Felicity Carter course of entrepreneurialism, because most people in this business don't know how to do cost of goods sold, how to do those sorts of things. What is the real cost? I mean, we did a story once about somewhere in southern France where one of the regional bodies had actually gone in and looked at people's production. And the problem with the region was that they had wines that went from sort of €2.99 to €20 on the shelf, and consumers there was no cue as to what they should be buying. Like why would you buy this €20 wine and not the €2 one? So the regional body was actually very good about taking experts into wineries. And what they discovered is that many people were producing wine to be sold at €2.99, not realising they were going broke, that the minimum for that region was €3.99 as the break-even point. And I think, it sounds ridiculous, but I think there's a lot of that going on.
So let's talk about wine and the moment it's in right now, or alcohol in the moment it's in right now. Tell me about what is the politics of wine right now over the last 5 years or so? What has changed and what does it look like right now?
So I talk a lot about the public health lobby, and people ask me to come and talk about that, or they ask me to write about that. And I keep saying what has changed in culture and the attitude towards alcohol did not come from the public health. It came from a number of things. So first of all, number one was the smartwatch. People started using the smartwatch and tracking what they were doing and realising that if they drank alcohol, they had more disturbed sleep. Social media has also meant that you've got a very risk-averse younger generation of people who do not want to be seen on social media being drunk or anything that could be used against them later. They're risk-averse anyway, so they don't want to take risks with their health. And then you've got the rise of sort of wellness culture in women on the one hand, but among men you've also got the rise of what you might call biohacking culture from Silicon Valley. And so you've got this sort of increasing message that the way to optimise yourself is to remove alcohol from your life. And so what's begun to happen is that as that sort of upswell of things is happening, is that the public health lobby is amplifying that. And when I say the public health lobby, I really need to distinguish there's sort of two groups of people. One is you get people who are quite properly involved in alcohol. So this is a vast group of people. This is people who are addiction specialists, who work with treatment, who are liver doctors, who are police, who have to pick up the pieces, governments who are worried about taxation and licensing and all of that. So there's a huge number of people involved in alcohol and in alcohol harms. But there's another group of people, and these are the people that I'm extremely interested in, who are present themselves as being the public health lobby, but many of them are temperance groups that have reinvented themselves as public health groups, and they are avowedly anti-alcohol, and there's been a lot more advocacy from those groups. And because this is something that's happening in the culture anyway, it's been amplified. And the other thing I think which has been a really big thing is that we've got an ageing population, and mostly people who read newspapers now are over the age of 45 or 50. So most newspapers that have survived are driven by data, and whatever works they do more of. And so especially post-COVID, their audiences are very interested in wellness and how to stay well, and so you're seeing more and more articles about how terrible alcohol is for you because there's more and more interest in people in sort of keeping in optimum health as they age.
You mentioned COVID. I'm curious in your perspective how COVID played a role in that.
COVID actually played an enormous role. I've spoken to a lot of people in this. I went to Brussels in December. I used my drinks insider money to do it, and I haven't written it up, so that's another thing I feel guilty about. Honestly, I like waking bed going, I should do this. But I went to Brussels for 3 days to talk to politicians who are involved in the wine issue in some way. So I talked to the head of the Wine and Spirits Intergroup, I talked to people involved in agriculture, I talked to alcohol lobbyists and whatever, and they all said that COVID fundamentally reset the relationship that people had with government. So for example, the EU was never very concerned about people's health before COVID. It's a trading body. They cared about harmonising trade regulations. But suddenly in COVID, you had governments who took upon themselves powers which we haven't seen in peacetime to protect the population from COVID. And so not only did governments themselves move much more into health and start thinking much more about health and population, but the population actually began to expect that governments would do this. It changed the calculus and the way people thought. And of course, COVID made people think about mortality and about health and whatever. So there's been a lot more, dare I say, paternalism around the question of health. There's been a lot more demand from populations that governments care about their health. And also people feel life is a lot more fragile as well.
It's a lot of different factors, as you mentioned, going on. So tell me about, in that, what impact does the WHO or the US Surgeon General have compared to the rest of those factors?
So it's one thing for a podcaster like Andrew Huberman to do a podcast about how alcohol is terrible, but when you have an authoritative voice like the Surgeon General or the WHO saying it, that's a whole different level of somebody saying it. That makes it an official statement rather than just wellness people on Instagram talking about why you should go sober curious. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to translate into changes in policy, but it definitely changes people's thinking.
So given that, and what happens next? What do you foresee? Is this something that's going to last? Is there a change coming?
So I think the anti-alcohol lobby has found their right moment. I think they're going to get louder and more aggressive. They're going to get much more of a hearing because of what I was saying about newspapers and media outlets. They're going to get an uncritical hearing. And it's something that's, from the wine trade perspective, it's something that's very difficult to argue about. Most people who work in wine are prevented by law from talking about anything to do with wine and health. It is illegal, especially here in the United States. So there's not even an ability to enter the discussion. And I think the question is, are there going to be legislative changes? Will we see things like cancer warning labels? And the answer is, I think eventually we probably will. If you look at the way that legislation spreads around the world, so Ireland is about to do cancer warning labels in 2026. Now, it took them 14 years to get to that point, and they had fights with the World Trade Organization and so on, but they have shown how it can be done. And now there are Baltic countries that are looking at it, and once that happens, it becomes something that almost becomes difficult for governments to resist.
How much impact does that have on consumers?
Obviously, it has some. If you look at tobacco, the reason that cancer warning labels are important is because if you introduce a cancer warning label, and there's a lot of research around this, it means the public is much more willing to accept other restrictions. So it's not that the cancer warning labels themselves are the big, bomb against alcohol. It's what they will lead to. So the process that is being applied is a process called denormalisation. It's what was applied against tobacco. So to remove tobacco advertising, marketing, sponsorship, and then you don't make the product illegal because everybody knows that prohibition doesn't work. But what you do is you reduce the places where you can use the product. So you can be a smoker now, and there's nowhere that you can smoke. Right. Now, I think this is one of the great public health victories of our time. I mean, as a kid growing up in a smoky environment, it was horrible. I mean, you get on a plane and adults would be smoking around you. It was terrible. So I'm very grateful that happened. But it means there's a pathway to do that to other commodities as well, and alcohol is there. So, for example, The Lancet has called for doctors to stop drinking alcohol at their conferences. There's a call in the UK to remove alcohol from Christmas parties and stuff to stop the peer pressure on people who don't want to drink and so on. Now, that's the process of denormalisation. So I think if we got cancer labels, you'd see a rapid escalation of denormalisation. So
interesting. So what do you foresee then as the future for the global wine industry or the American wine industry? With all the headwinds, what comes next? Does it survive in the way it is? Does it have to make big changes?
No, but I want to be really clear that what's happening now is not because of the public health messaging, wherever it's coming from. There are very significant underlying problems in the world of wine. There's overproduction, there's bad business practices, there's questions about whether premiumisation of the last 15 years has driven away new consumers. As consumption falls, there's too much wine being produced, and we're already seeing sort of vineyards being ripped up around the world. There's going to be a lot more of that. Long term, so I don't think in the short term the health thing is actually as massive a deal as. I find it really interesting reporting on it, but I don't want to make it sound like it's the only thing facing the wine industry. It has to be my interest. Long term, though, I think it's an existential threat. So again, if you want to see what's going to happen, always look at tobacco. So tobacco became extremely stigmatised. Nobody will stand up for the right to defend it. And yet anything that rich people do remains protected. So nobody has a problem with cigar smoking, even though it's really bad for you. It's really, really bad for you. So I think fine wine and investment grade wine will always be fine because it's a status good. The question is what happens to all the other wine.
You mentioned the other issues at bay right now, or at play right now, over less consumption, overproduction. How does that fix itself? What does the next decade look like in those terms?
I hesitate to say this because it's the human cost is awful, but there's probably a lot of vineyards that need to go. I think as brutal as it is, the wine world will be better, especially in my country, Australia, for example. There's a lot of, and I don't wish harm on anybody. You know, when these things happen, they're a path to divorce and bankruptcy and bad retirements and worse. But Australia exports a lot of commodity wine that is irrigated. It's using Australia's most precious resource, water, to sell, cheap bottles of wine. I won't be sad when that stops. And I think Australia is not the only place where that happens. So I don't ever want to see wine become a good that is only available to people with money, but at the same time, I'm not that sad that some segments of the market will probably disappear. So
we'll change gears a little bit and talk about Oregon a little bit. I'm curious about your sort of perspectives on the Oregon wine industry. I know it's not been a focus of yours, but what do you see from the outside in Oregon? How has the industry grown, and what is how does the rest of the world view it?
Well, funny you should ask that, because for years I used to go to Provine, the big wine trade fair in Dusseldorf, and there was always this great stand where, the first couple of years I went, I was just sort of not knowing how to, navigate the aisles and stuff. And then there came a point where I got to this perfect equilibrium where I knew that at 5:30 you'd go over to the Spanish stand because they had gin and tonics, and then at 6 o'clock you'd go over to Bibendum and, you'd talk to people. And they always had bottles of Oregon there. So we'd sit around until basically we got chucked out of Provine. And there were a whole bunch of people from Oregon who would bring over wines and we'd taste them. So my view of Oregon, a personal point of view, is that it's a very nice end to a day running around a very bleak set of trade halls. But my perception of Oregon has always been that it reputationally is very, very good. It's best known for Pinot Noir, which is a fantastic grape to be growing at the moment. So, Burgundy prices have gone silly, and so most people can't afford Burgundy any longer, and the Burgundy that they can afford is not that great. So the great stuff is gone. So what you're seeing is the world trying to look for substitutes, and already, Oregon is a great sort of, I don't wish to say substitute in the sense of, it's not as good as, but it means that people still want Pinot Noir, and now they're looking and they're discovering it from other places. They're discovering it from Otago in New Zealand, they're discovering it from Tasmania, they're discovering it from Germany, which makes absolutely wonderful Pinot Noirs. And that wouldn't have happened if Burgundy prices hadn't gone through the roof. So I think if you're in a quality area that produces Pinot Noir, at the moment, you're one of the best placed people in the world.
Have you noticed Oregon more in conversation, more noticed internationally than before? Does it feel like it's more part of the conversation?
No, and I'll tell you why not. It's because the United States is so willing to take the product that it's never been a priority for US wineries to export. And also Oregon doesn't produce that much, right? So I can see at the moment when I go to wine trade fairs that there's more Californians than there are usually, because usually they don't bother trying to export, not the better stuff. There's a lot of commercial wines that get exported, but it has never been a priority for Americans to export, because you have a big market that's always taken it. And what that means, and also American wines are quite expensive compared to wines from elsewhere, and so what that means is it's just not possible to be part of the conversation in the same way. Now, the number of French companies that have moved into Oregon has really sparked a conversation.
What way?
Well, it's awful to say it, but it's still kind of a proof of concept. When people like Bollinger and the Burgundy houses turn up and they buy your land, it's kind of like, woo, yeah, these are people who really know what they're talking about.
So obviously you have a lot of different projects going on right now. Tell me about what's next for you. What are you looking forward to? What have you not done yet in your career that you want to do?
I want to write another book. So I wrote books years ago, not exciting ones. I wrote a book on careers in fashion, which actually turned into a bestseller. I still get royalties from it 15 years later. Isn't that amazing? And I wrote one on careers in accounting, which a reviewer in the Sydney Morning Herald said she made a dry subject tolerable. So I figure that, it's now time to take those same skills and write a proper book of non-fiction. And don't ask me what it's going to be about. I know what it's going to be about, but I'm going to keep it to myself.
That's fair. Anything else that you're looking forward to?
I'm spending a lot of time just thinking how to survive the collapse of the media. So that's not a very good answer, is it? Of course, I'm looking forward to everything. I'm going to spend today in Oregon, and I'm going to spend tomorrow going out in wineries, and I can't wait to do that. It's amazing. I mean, the thing about this world, for all of its frustrations and for all the things I can criticise about it is an amazing life. I mean, you know, it is mandatory that you go to nice places and then you sit down and have nice food and wine, right? If you don't do that, you've got no place in this world. You know, and what a fantastic life.
Right. Last question for you. What is your greatest achievement or proudest accomplishment so far?
I think in my career as a wine editor and a wine journalist, I think I've been useful. I think, you know, a lot of people would write and they'd say, you know, I found that really useful. I used it in my business. I grew my business. It's not glamorous. It's not an amazing thing to point to, but I think I did, and I have done things that people find useful.
It's a pretty noble cause, I think.
I wish I could say, you know, I had all these plans when I was younger. I was going to win the Booker Prize by 30, you know, and that didn't quite work out the way I hoped, I have to say. So eventually, you know, I was like, I'm the editor of a wine trade magazine. This isn't the New Yorker, which is, you know, where I imagined I should be. And it still surprises me. You know, people have got imposter syndrome. I've got the opposite, where I wake up in the morning and think, why am I not the editor of the New Yorker? But anyway, so I thought about this a long time ago, and I thought, well, I've got this. This is what I've got, and I can be as useful as possible. So that was what I decided to do.
Fantastic. I love it. All right. All the questions that I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have, or anything that you...
No, you've covered absolutely everything.
Okay. Absolutely everything.
Absolutely everything.
Amazing. All right. Thank you so much for taking the time, sharing your story. Welcome to Oregon, and hoping you're enjoying your time here so far.
It's fantastic, and thank you so much for having me.
Of course. Wonderful. Thank you. We'll let you off the hook.